Ever lay awake at like 2 in the morning wondering, what is this all about? What's my purpose?
Oh, absolutely.
It's a universal question, right?
Yeah.
And we're diving into Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life to see what he has to say about it.
Okay.
So you've got your excerpts.
Right.
And I think one of the things that struck me right off the bat is he doesn't want us to start with ourselves.
No, he doesn't. He wants us to kind of flip the script on how we normally approach this question.
Right, because we think, okay, what do I like?
Right.
What am I good at?
What am I good at? What are my strengths?
What's my career path going to be?
Yeah, exactly.
All very self-focused.
Totally.
He says, nope, wrong starting point.
Yeah, and I think that's what's intriguing about his approach.
Yeah.
It's this idea that we have to start with the foundation.
Okay.
And that foundation isn't us.
So where is it?
Well, it's this recognition that we're created.
Okay.
We were created by someone for a reason, and that's where purpose begins.
So it's not finding myself, it's understanding myself through the lens of being created.
Precisely.
Okay, so that's a huge shift in perspective.
It is.
But then he takes it a step further and he says, and by the way, this isn't just about your 70, 80, 90 years on Earth.
Right. This is where the eternal perspective comes in.
Okay, well...
And that kind of blows things wide open.
It does, because if I'm thinking about, okay, what's my purpose? I'm thinking about this life.
Right.
I'm thinking about my career.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about my relationships.
Your impact.
But if this is actually just the kind of the first act.
The first act
Of a much bigger play.
It changes how we see everything, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
How does it change how we view, then, this life?
I think it gives us a sense of, I don't want to say insignificance, because our lives are very significant.
Right.
But it helps us to see things through a much larger lens.
Like zooming out on a map.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Suddenly, what seemed really big is like one tiny little piece of a much bigger journey.
Precisely. Yeah.
So how do we then approach this life, this kind of pre-eternity, if you will?
Yeah, I love that pre-eternity.
Right.
I like that.
Because are we then just not supposed to care about this life? Is that what he's saying?
No, and he uses a couple of metaphors that I think are really helpful.
Okay.
One is he compares life to a divine exam.
Okay.
But here's the kicker. The answers are already provided.
I was going to say, I like the sound of that. That takes the pressure off.
Right.
Like, I've got the cheat sheet.
We kind of do.
Okay.
But then he uses another metaphor that adds a layer of responsibility to it.
Okay.
And he talks about life as a trust.
Okay.
So we've been given these resources, our time, our talents, our opportunities.
Okay.
But the owner has expectations.
So it's less about just coasting through at the cheat sheet
Exactly.
and more about, I've been given something really precious.
Exactly.
And I need to make the most of it.
Yes. And I think that's a beautiful tension.
Yeah.
It's this idea that we have freedom, but also responsibility.
And that's where it seems like joy and fulfillment come in, right?
Exactly. That's where things get really interesting.
You said it gets interesting when we start talking about joy and fulfillment. So where does that fit in with Warren's idea of a purpose-driven life?
Well, he actually says that we were meant to be enjoyed.
Wow.
Isn't that a cool thought?
It is, because like we don't often associate joy with purpose, do we?
Right.
We think, grind.
Duty, obligation.
Yeah, responsibility.
And while those things are part of it,
Right.
Warren emphasizes that our purpose is ultimately rooted in joy,
Okay.
both our own joy and God's joy.
So it's not this like burden, right? This heavy thing that we have to carry around.
Not at all. It's actually meant to be a source of delight.
That changes how we approach it then.
It does, right. It's like if you're approaching something from a place of joy, you're going to show up differently. You're going to engage with it differently.
So I'm thinking about worship, because that's often something that we think is kind of a part of this purpose-driven life.
Right, and it plays a role.
But it's not just about singing songs on Sunday, is it?
No, and that's something Warren really emphasizes.
Okay.
He says that worship is so much bigger than that.
So what does he say?
Yeah.
How do we worship if it's not just about going to church?
It's about how we live our lives.
Every day.
Every single day.
So it's like our actions are a form of worship.
Exactly. It's about aligning our actions with what we believe,
Okay.
with who we say we follow.
So bringing it back to this idea of surrender,
Yes.
then,
Yes.
because if our purpose is rooted in this joy, in this God who delights in us,
Right.
then surrender becomes less about I have to
I should.
and more about I want to.
Exactly. Because it's the best way to experience that joy, that fulfillment.
Okay, so then unpack surrender for me a little bit, because it's kind of a loaded word, isn't it?
It is. And I think a lot of people hear surrender and they think give up or roll over.
Like wave the white flag.
Exactly. But Warren's view of surrender is actually very empowering.
Okay, how so?
Well, he talks about it as aligning our will with God's will.
So it's about trust then,
Absolutely. It's about trusting that God's plan for our lives is good,
even when we don't understand it.
even when we don't understand it.
And that's hard
It is hard, yeah.
because we want to be in control.
We do.
We like to have a plan.
We like to know what's coming next, right?
Exactly.
But what Warren suggests is that true freedom, true joy actually comes from letting go of that need for control.
Okay, that makes sense. But what are some of the things that trip us up? Like, what are some of the roadblocks that prevent us from surrendering?
Warren talks about three main ones.
Okay, hit me.
First is fear.
Okay.
We're afraid of what we might have to give up, afraid of the unknown.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The second roadblock is pride.
Oh, that's a big one.
It is, right? Our ego wants to be in the driver's seat.
We want the credit.
Exactly. And then the third roadblock is confusion
Confusion about,
what surrender actually looks like in everyday life.
yeah, because it can seem kind of abstract, right?
It can feel very theoretical, and people are like, okay, but what does that mean I do on a Tuesday afternoon?
Right, exactly.
So it's about bridging that gap between the concept and the practice.
So how do we do that? How do we move from knowing about surrender to actually living a surrendered life?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
You were saying it gets really interesting when we talk about actually living a surrendered life.
It does, because it's not this passive thing.
Right.
It's not about just, like, sitting back and waiting for instructions.
Right.
It's about this active engagement with our lives, but from a place of surrender.
Okay, so how do we even begin to do that?
Well, this is where Warren's idea of becoming more like Jesus comes in.
Okay.
And he's clear that it's not about imitation.
Right.
It's not about, like, trying to dress like him or talk like him.
We're not all trying to grow beards out here.
Exactly. It's about something much deeper.
Okay.
It's about allowing his character to shape and transform us from the inside out.
Okay, so less about the external and more about the internal.
Exactly.
But how do we actually cultivate that? Because it can feel kind of abstract.
It can, and I think that's why Warren emphasizes action.
Okay.
It's in the doing, in the responding to challenges in a Christ-like way that we really grow.
So it's not just about reading the instruction manual, it's about actually getting your hands dirty.
Exactly. It's about, like, taking what we know and putting it into practice.
And I remember when I was reading this section, I was really struck by this idea of the opposite growth plan.
Yes.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely. It's this idea that if you want to grow in patience, you're going to be presented with opportunities to be impatient.
Oh, that's good.
If you want to be more loving, you're going to encounter people who are really hard to love.
So it's like life throws you exactly what you need, even if it's not what you want.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing those moments as opportunities for growth.
It's about reframing those challenges, right?
Absolutely.
Instead of seeing them as obstacles, we can see them as opportunities to kind of flex those spiritual muscles.
I love that.
Yeah.
Flexing those spiritual muscles.
Yeah. And that ties back into that analogy of the refiner's fire,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like the heat is intense.
It is.
It's uncomfortable,
Yeah.
but it's producing something beautiful and valuable.
It refines us. It purifies us.
So when we talk about living out this purpose, living out this surrendered life, it happens in community, right?
Absolutely. And this is where Warren talks about the church as God's gym for love.
I love that analogy.
Such a good one, right?
It is.
Because it's like, we can't grow in isolation.
Right. We need those other people to like kind of help us along the way.
We need people to challenge us, to encourage us, to hold us accountable.
And to mess up with us, too.
Yes, absolutely. We're all in this together.
And that's where I think the beauty of this whole thing really comes in, right?
It does.
It's like, we're not perfect.
No.
We're all messy. We're all figuring this out as we go.
And that's okay.
But when we can come together with all of our imperfections and support each other and encourage each other.
And love each other.
Yes.
That's when we really start to experience the fullness of what it means to live a purpose-driven life.
And that's where this idea of finding our shape for service comes in, right?
Exactly. Because as we grow in community, as we allow ourselves to be shaped by that love and that grace,
Right.
we start to discover our unique gifts and passions.
So it's not about like fitting into some predetermined mold.
No.
It's about figuring out what makes you you.
Yes. And using that
Yeah.
to make a difference in the world.
So for the person listening right now who's thinking, okay, I love all of this, but where do I even begin?
Right.
What would you say?
I would say Start small.
Okay.
You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have some grand plan.
Right.
Just take one step today.
Any step.
Any step in the direction of what you feel called to do.
And trust that it matters.
Absolutely, because it does.
Even if it feels small.
Even if it feels insignificant.
Because it's all part of this bigger picture.
It's all part of this beautiful tapestry that God is weaving together.
I love that visual.
And you have a part to play in it.
We all do.
It's been such a pleasure to dive into these ideas with you.
It really has. It's been such a thought-provoking conversation.
It always is when we talk about purpose.
Well, for everyone listening, this isn't the end of the conversation. It's just the beginning.
That's right.
So keep exploring these ideas, keep asking those big questions, and most importantly, keep living out your purpose.
Oh, beautifully said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
We'll see you then.